I think many of you will have asked yourselves, and so what? What can I do with it? How can I translate my concern for purpose into P&L results? It's a very legitimate question. It's a very relevant question. And our second speaker, Professor Alex Edmans, is going to address precisely this question. Now, I have not come across many finance professors to be concerned with purpose, but Alex Edmans is one of them. Part of his career is to explore from a financial point of view the value of purpose, and the title of his book, Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit, says it all. I think it's a summary of what he's going to talk about. Profit and purpose. How the two can be combined, how the pie may grow. It is a pity we cannot have Professor Edmans with us. He's a professor at the London Business School. For technical reasons, the 10:30 night flight from London to Athens, the Aegean flight, had some technical problems, so he couldn't, it was cancelled. But anyway, we did our best to have him with us online, and he will address our conference via Zoom. Alex, we're delighted to have you, even virtually, and we are very eager to listen to what you have to say to us.
But that was also heavily delayed, so the best thing is to do this by Zoom. So as was mentioned, I am going to talk about the power of purposeful business, which is purpose from a financial and commercial perspective. Right, we often think about the moral and ethical case for purpose, and morals and ethics are certainly important, but without a clear business and financial case, this will always be secondary to many CEOs. And as Sarah says, right, it's normally quite rare for a finance person to be so positive about purpose because we often think it's a distraction from profits. But my research shows that this is something which is really good for the bottom line. I'm a professor of finance. I'm a former investment banker at Morgan Stanley. But even though my perspective is a financial one, I am still somebody who's very positive about the importance of purpose. Now, I think a good place to start is to explain, well, what do I mean by a company's purpose? And you might think, well, that's surprising that I'm asking this because don't we all know this? That's the goal of today's conference. But I might actually have a somewhat different view of purpose to what we typically think about. And to show you this different view, let me take you on a little bit of a journey. So halfway around the world, I'd like to take you to the Great Rift Valley. This stretches across 2 continents and 6,000 kilometers, from Lebanon in Asia to Mozambique in Africa. And it has some of the world's highest mountains like this one, but also some of the world's deepest lakes. And one of these lakes is a lake called Lake Magadi, which is in the Kenyan stretch of the Great Rift Valley. Now, fewer than 1,000 people call the lake their home. And one of these people is a gentleman called Emmanuel Saronga, and he makes a living selling and herding goats. Now, for Emmanuel, it used to be that cash was king. When he sold a goat, he'd receive cash, but he'd then have to check that cash in case it was forged. He'd store that cash and worry about it being stolen. And then to bank that cash, he had to walk an entire day to get to the nearest bank. So his life was really tough. He couldn't graze his goats on the greenest pastures. He always had to be within 1 day of a bank. But all of that changed due to a purposeful business. And that company is Vodafone, the UK telecoms giant. Because in 2007, Vodafone launched M-Pesa, a mobile money service in Kenya. So what is mobile money? We often think it's mobile banking, right? I have a bank account and I can operate it on my phone. I don't need to go to the branch. But with mobile money, you don't even need a bank account to begin with. And that's really powerful because at the time, 15 million Kenyan adults had no access to banking. So this completely transformed Emmanuel's life. He doesn't need to worry with cash anymore. He doesn't need to be concerned about robbery or forgery. and he can graze his goats where he wants to. But this is not a story about one person. This is a story about hundreds of thousands of people. Because within the first 7 years of the launch of M-Pesa, 200,000 households got lifted out of poverty. And many of these households were headed up by women. It allowed them to move from agriculture to business and retail, so there was a large effect on gender equality. So that's one story I'm going to tell you about Vodafone. But I now want to tell you a different story. And this different story surrounds tax, because in 2012, Vodafone became the first telecoms company around the world to release a tax transparency report showing how much tax they were paying to governments worldwide. And obviously, fair tax is very important, particularly in telecoms, where you could choose to locate your licenses in low-tax countries. So I've got two questions for everybody in the audience to think about. The first is, which of these decisions, launching M-Pesa or releasing the tax transparency report, created most value for society? And the second is, which of these decisions, if it had not been taken, would have led to the most public outrage or worsened Vodafone's ESG rating or reputation? I'm not going to poll anybody. We're going to have time for Q&A at the end. And why I'm not going to poll anybody is most people agree with the answers. Which decision created most value for society? It was the first one. By launching M-Pesa, Vodafone lifted 200,000 households out of poverty and contributed to gender diversity. But if I turn to the second question, what would have been the outrage if Vodafone had not launched M-Pesa? It would have been nothing. But you don't get slammed by the media for not coming up with an innovation. You would not have suffered a customer boycott for not coming up with this crazy idea of banking without a bank, because nobody would have expected you to do that to begin with. But what is the outrage for not being transparent on tax? It could be huge. And indeed, Vodafone themselves had suffered a nationwide boycott of their stores 2 years previously because of concerns they were not paying enough tax. So this is the different view of purpose that will be the common theme throughout my talk. We often think about purpose as the answer to that second question. Purposeful businesses should do no harm. We should not cheat on tax. We should not pollute the environment. We should not mistreat our workers. And please don't get me wrong. Absolutely, a purposeful company should not create harm. But my view is that it's not enough for a company just to say, I'm being purposeful, I'm not creating harm. Instead, a purposeful company needs to answer that first question and actively do good. So what is purpose about? It's about actively creating value for society, not just avoiding harm. And so why is that my view of purpose? Well, first, there's the moral and ethical reason. In 2022, given the scale of the challenges the world faces, it's not enough for a company to just do no harm. It needs to actively do good and contribute towards solving the big challenges of our time, be this inclusion, be this equality, be this automation or climate change. But remember, I said that my theme of the talk would not be the moral and ethical case, but it would be the financial and business case. And what is the financial and business case of answering that second question? It's about just risk management. But we do no harm because we want to avoid a scandal. We don't want to be like Wells Fargo opening fake bank accounts. We don't want to be Volkswagen in a emissions test scandal. And we don't want to be Rio Tinto blowing up Jukan Gorge. But if the financial and business case is only about doing no harm, then we just want to do the minimum possible to avoid a scandal. There is no need to go above and beyond that small minimum. But instead, if I think about the financial and business case for actively doing good, that is far more powerful. Why? Because if actively doing good involves creating value, even if the value that we create is social value, it might ultimately lead to financial value and shareholder returns. And that's the entire thesis of my recent book that Zaris mentioned on growing the pie. So let me illustrate this framework and then go to the data and then go into how do we put this into practice as a CEO. So what is the framework? What is the pie? The pie is the value that a company creates. And it can be divided between profits to investors, that's the blue, and value to society, that's the orange, fair taxes, fair wages, fair prices. And often we think that what is purpose about is about splitting the pie more fairly. Pay higher taxes than we can get away with. We can make sure that we're giving fair prices to customers and donating our profits to charity. And again, don't get me wrong, part of purpose is about fairness, but purpose must be more than just that. Why? Because if purpose involves splitting the pie differently, then it just reduces the company's profits. And then very few CEOs would take purpose seriously. Indeed, we saw nearly 3 years ago, 181 CEOs in the US signed the Business Roundtable statement saying, I'm going to serve wider society, but many of them just didn't put it into practice. And why would they? If indeed purpose makes my company less profitable, why would I ever want to do this? Let me just sign a nice statement, talk about a lot of things, as Nicholas said earlier, but really not put it into practice. So I view purpose as being about growing the pie. Right, so we absolutely do want to increase the orange, we want to serve society, but the way we do that is not by giving a greater slice of what's already there, charitable donations, or even higher wages, but through innovation, through excellence, through coming up with some crazy ideas like banking without a bank. Because why is that so powerful? Even if your innovation is driven by the idea to solve a social problem, not to make money, ultimately, things that do create value for society are things that you can eventually monetize. Right? Because Vodafone did launch M-Pesa genuinely to help society to solve the problem of financial inclusion in Kenya, but ultimately they found a way to monetize it and earn profits from it. So this is the power of purpose. If it leads us to create value to society, to innovate, ultimately those innovations may well be monetizable. And Nicholas talked about this in the example of Tesla. Now, at this point in my talk, 10 minutes in, you might think, well, what I say sounds great, but where's the evidence? Well, it seems a bit like wishful thinking. Like, what I seem to be saying to you is that companies should just focus on purpose and just do the right thing. And if they do the right thing, then magically some profits will appear later. But that almost seems too good to be true. Right? I have told you about one company, Vodafone, where this worked, but you might think, have I just handpicked that one company because it supports my argument? Maybe for most companies, purpose is at the expense of profit. So this is why my day job as a business school professor is not to tell stories, it's not even to write case studies, but it's to analyze hundreds of companies across dozens of industries over multiple years. So some of the CEOs in the audience, most of you, will not be in the telecoms industry, so you might think, well, how does this story apply to you? So now what I want to look at is some of my own research looking at the link between purpose and profit. And the big question here is you might think, well, how do you measure purpose? You might think, well, can we analyze which company has the strongest purpose statement? But that's problematic. You could say a lot of things, but not put it into practice, as Zavis was saying earlier. You might think, well, can we look at the quality of a company's products? But if a company with good products does well, that could be nothing to do with purpose. It's just obvious that a company with good products should do well. So what I chose to look at is how well a company treats its employees. So why did I choose to look at employees? Well, they are a stakeholder, they are part of wider society. But importantly, they are the most important stakeholder in nearly every country, right, in nearly every company. Because you might think, isn't purpose about climate? Well, climate is really important, but climate might be important in energy. It's not so important in tech. Whereas in nearly every company, employees are important, but it's actually not obvious that you want to treat your employees as best as possible. Why? Because treating your workers well is costly. And indeed, many people run their business by thinking, how do I get as much as possible out of my employees while paying them as little as possible? Indeed, even in my prior career of investment banking, you had high human capital, but there the management practices were to try to work you as hard as possible to maximize what they could get. So what I'm looking at here is a different way of managing your workers, a purposeful way. So let's provide an environment where there's meaningful work, skills development, you're valued as people, and you have a healthy, enriching environment. Notice, this is not just about doing no harm. It's not the minimum to avoid a scandal, to avoid a strike, but can we actively do good? Can we provide workplaces with credibility, with respect, with fairness and pride and camaraderie? And so that's what the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America looks at. There are similar lists in other countries around the world, including in Greece. And the real value of this list is it was available from 1984, so I have tons of data. So because purpose is a pretty new thing, many data sets on ESG have only been around for the last, let's say, 12 years. And if I showed you that purpose paid off between 2010 and 2019, you might think, well, those were 10 great years for the stock market. Maybe it only works in an upswing, maybe in a pandemic, in a recession, it doesn't pay off, we should just focus on profits. But because my data started in 1984, I had things like the financial crisis, like September the 11th, like the collapse of the internet bubble, so I could make sure that this also pays off in the downtimes to make sure there is a strong financial case. So what I looked at was the performance of these best companies to work for compared to their peers. And the bottom line was that the 100 best companies to work for in America delivered shareholder returns that beat their peers by 2.3 to 3.8% every year for a 28-year period. That is 89 to 184% cumulative. So if we step back from the data, what does this mean for CEOs? It means that treating your workers well is not just moral and ethical, it's just business and commercially sensible. Right, you are investing in your greatest asset. Yes, it does cost money, but that money doesn't just give pie to employees. It grows the pie, employees become more motivated and more productive, and therefore shareholder returns benefit in the long term. Now, you might be skeptical because you might think, is this correlation or is this causation? And indeed, one of my roles as a finance professor is to make sure that anything that I give you is something which is robust rather than just a nice correlation. So my story seems to be that employee satisfaction causes better performance, but maybe you might think it's the opposite direction. Once a company is performing well, then it can spend on its employees. So I have to do a lot of work to rule that out. Maybe there's omitted factors. Maybe in the tech industry, employees are happy just because of the nature of the work. And maybe in the tech industry, performance has been good just because there's a tech boom. So while it took 4 years of really hard work to complete the study, it was to rule out those alternative explanations. But even if you believe everything I've said so far, you still might be skeptical because you might think, do you need a purpose to know to treat your employees well? Perhaps all you need to do is to think about profit. Right, any CEO should think, if my goal is just to make as much money as possible, maybe I do want to treat my employees well because they'll be more motivated and more productive, and therefore they're going to make me more money down the road. So do you need a purpose to treat employees well? And indeed, looking at Elon Musk, who I fully agree with Nikos, I think he's a great example of a purposeful leader. But just to play devil's advocate, people might say, well, did he have a purpose? Or is it just the fact that electric cars are profitable? Right, do I decide to build electric cars? I can estimate how many cars will I make, how much I can sell them for, and if the revenues exceed the costs, I'm going to go ahead. Well, I don't need to care about climate change. I only need to care about profit. And if I care about profit, I will just build the electric car factory and treat my workers well because there's money in it for me. But many decisions you cannot reduce to a financial calculation. So if I go back to Vodafone and M-Pesa, what was the financial case for justifying this? There was no financial case. Right at the time, Vodafone had a clear strategy. Its strategy was to win spectrum license auctions and expand in the West because that was where there was the biggest market. Right? There was no market for investing in M-Pesa. The tech challenges were huge. Could they pull it off? And even if they pulled it off, there was no money to be made from serving some of the poorest people in the world. But this is why I find purpose so powerful. Right, the power of purpose is it frees us from having to justify every decision with a financial calculation. Instead, the justification is, can I build a better world? And this frees us, it spurs us, it inspires us to create, to discover, to explore, to come up with things that ultimately end up being successful and end up being monetizable like M-Pesa. But we could have never predicted the profits from the outset. Why? Because it's just too far off, and because profits often come from really unexpected sources. Right, so why did Vodafone pursue M-Pesa? Its purpose was to build a digital society that enhances socioeconomic progress. They did that because it was consistent with its purpose, and in the end, it was able to monetize it, but it would have never been able to predict those profits from the outset. You would have never been able to use a financial spreadsheet calculation to justify that decision. So where is the evidence that profits are unexpected? Right? You often think that if you forecast well enough, can't you always be able to predict the future, at least with some degree of certainty? Well, actually, no. So I'd like to draw some from research by Caroline Flammer at Columbia. So what she looked at was shareholder proposals to make a company more purposeful. So what this is when shareholders go to an annual general meeting and they propose, let's say, to reduce carbon emissions or to implement an anti-discrimination policy. And what she found was that after those proposals are passed, profits go up, sales go up, and the stock price will go up. So even though these proposals aim to create more value for society, not to make money, ultimately, profits went up anyway. Why? Because they grew the pie. But this pie growing idea is actually not the reason why I want to explain that paper to you. It's instead because if the profit mindset was enough, you should not need those proposals. Like any CEO should know that anti-discrimination policies are good for my profits because they will improve employee morale. So any CEO who cares about profits should have anyway put in these anti-discrimination policies. But they didn't. Right? It took the diverse perspectives of outside shareholders with a purpose mandate to open their eyes and to put these proposals upon them, because just the sole focus on profit would not lead you to make a decision that ultimately ended up being profitable. So in the final stage of my talk, let me now think about how to put it into practice. Right, so the first step of my talk was, what is purpose? It's about actively creating value, not just doing no harm. The second part is this does create value for shareholders. There is a financial case, and it's actually even more powerful to think about purpose rather than just thinking about profits. Why? Because it will allow you to make decisions that you would not justify with a financial spreadsheet. But the third is, well, how do you put this idea into practice? And to answer this question, let me start with something which actually doesn't really have anything to do with purpose. It's about excellence. Right, so for many companies, simply being excellent at what you do has a major impact on society. Right, so just take airlines. So airlines obviously really important for them, is reducing their carbon footprint, doing no harm, but just being excellent at flying their planes, that has a huge impact. And we already see one consequence of the lack of excellence is, unfortunately, I'm not be able to be here physically with you today. Now, that might seem obvious, but often when we think about what does it mean to be a purposeful airline, we only think about carbon emissions or how well you treat your employees, not the core business of can you actually get your planes to fly? And if you can do that, that has so much of a positive impact on society, when it's often just underplayed, when we often think about doing no harm. Now, you might think, well, isn't it obvious that every company should try to be excellent? Even if the company was only focused on profits, you do need a purpose to be excellent. But actually, no. Because yes, a profit-making company will choose to be excellent in things that clearly will make it money, but it might not choose to be excellent in things which create value for society rather than directly for shareholders. So it's the idea of excellence that Vodafone chose, not only to launch M-Pesa, but to make it work and to make it work really well. So let's ensure that it's completely resistant to things like money laundering and any of the other issues that you might get here. Let's try to care about this as much as we would our telephone plan for UK or customers, for example. My second point is back to purpose, and it's now to drill a level deeper into what does it mean for a company to actually be purposeful. So some companies have purpose statements that look like this. Our purpose is to serve customers, workers, suppliers, the environment and communities, and investors. Now that sounds fantastic. That sounds so inspiring, you're going to serve everybody. But to any CEO, this is meaningless, right? It doesn't provide you any guidance of how to navigate trade-offs. You can't please everybody, right? If you're an energy company and you close down a polluting plant, that is good for the environment, but it's bad for workers. So to claim that you're going to serve everybody, how does that help a CEO resolve the difficult trade-offs that you have to do on a common basis? It doesn't. And also it means that anything goes. What I've said, what a purposeful company should do is to not just use financial spreadsheets and net present value to make decisions, but how can that help you make a decision, right? Because you're never going to get projects that serve everybody. So there's no way of figuring out how to make a decision. It's going to be quite arbitrary. But if I think about what does the word purpose mean in the English language, it does not mean altruism. It does not mean serving everybody. Purpose means being focused and targeted. A purposeful meeting is one with a clear agenda. If I do something on purpose, I'm going to do it deliberately. So what I define purpose as is why a company exists, who it serves, its reason for being, and the role that it plays in the world. And that might sound pretty lofty and idealistic, so let me pick it apart. So the first thing to highlight is that purpose is about service, right? A purpose cannot be to make profits. Profits are important, but profits are a byproduct of serving society, they're not the end goal. As I mentioned earlier, Vodafone's purpose to build a digital society that enhances socioeconomic progress. If they do that, then they will be profitable. The second key point is that a purpose has to be focused, as I mentioned. Why you exist, who you serve, your reason for being, and the role that you play, they all have to be specific. And so a purposeful company is not one that tries to solve all 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals. Instead, it's your responsibility to only focus on maybe the 3 or 4 that you can really move the needle on. It is not your responsibility to try to solve all of the world's problems and to be all things to all people. So, how do we decide what to focus on? Well, there's 2 aspects. I talked about the why and the who. So who do we choose to serve? We would love to serve all of these constituencies, but there are trade-offs. So what is really key is this idea of materiality. So there are some stakeholders who are more important to you than others, depending on your business. And so what I'm showing here is the materiality map of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And so what this looks at is, in each industry, what are the most important stakeholders for your company's success? So if I take the first column, which is mining, the environment really matters. Why? Because if you're Rio Tinto and you blow up Juukan Gorge, that's really bad for your business. But if I go to the second column, which is financials, banks, actually even more important are things like social capital, selling practices and product labeling. Why? Because what you're selling is a financial institution, are complex products. You might not have high financial literacy. And so if you are like Wells Fargo, and if you're in a fake bank account scandal, that is really bad for your reputation. And so why is materiality important? Because what you need to do is to stress and really focus on the most material issues for your business. It is not one size fits all. It depends from industry to industry. And this is backed up by the data. So this is a famous study which looks at companies that do well on ESG across the board. They tick every single box. These companies actually don't beat the market. They only beat the market by 1.5% per year, which is insignificant. But when the authors redid the study with a materiality lens, looking at companies that do well on the material issues, but scale back on the immaterial ones, they did beat the market by 4.8% per year. So what does it mean to be purposeful? Not to serve every single stakeholder, but to understand which are the ones that are most important for my long-term company success and really focus on them. So that's the who, that's who do we serve. But what's the second one? It's the why. Why do we exist? And what I'm highlighting here is the idea of comparative advantage. Right, there are so many problems in the world, but it's your responsibility as a company not to try to solve all of them, but to focus on the ones that you have unique expertise in solving. So many people think that purpose involves donating lots of money to charity. Right, that's really great for public relations, but most companies have no comparative advantage in choosing which charities are most worthy. Right, for Vodafone, their expertise was in telecoms. How do they know whether a cancer charity is better than a heart disease charity or an animal rights charity? So instead, they focused on their expertise. Right, what their expertise was having a technology to transfer text messages, and they used this instead to transfer mobile money. Another way to think about comparative advantage is to ask yourself this question. What is in my hand? What are the resources and what is the expertise that my company has, and how can I use this to serve wider society? And if there's one thing that I want you to take away from this talk, it is this question. You are all CEOs of this business, right? I talk to a lot of companies about purpose, but it's rare for me to talk to such a senior audience where you have the power of your company and you can use what is in your hand. And the power of thinking about purpose as using what is in your hand is that that's something that companies can practice in nearly all economic conditions. So let's take the recent pandemic. Right, so there are many companies which engage in purposeful things to split the pie differently. So you have Unilever, who gave up 100 million euros of food and sanitizer to help local customers. There were many CEOs who gave up their pay. Now that's inspiring if you split the pie and give up part of the pie, but that's unrealistic, right? There are many companies that just did not have pie to give, right? What if you are not in the food and sanitizer industry? And what if you don't have 100 million euros lying around? But if the power of purpose is using what is in your hand, if it's growing the pie and actively creating value, then that's something you can do even if you're in an unrelated industry. So let's take Mercedes, the car company, right? In particular, Mercedes powertrain, which makes Formula One engines. That is useless in a pandemic. But what is in your hand, if you are Mercedes powertrain, it is precision engineering expertise. And that same precision that you need to make a Formula One engine, you use that to make ventilators. And so they use that expertise to mass produce ventilators at scale, saving thousands of lives. And importantly, this also applies to small companies. But often we think purpose, that's great for a massive company to be able to do, they can afford it, but if I'm a smaller company, how can I afford being purposeful? So let me give you an example from a company that I'm a customer of. It's called Barry's Bootcamp. It's a small chain of gyms in London and also in other countries. Now, in the pandemic, the gyms were closed because of the lockdown. But what was in their hand is fitness expertise, and they used that to offer free online classes through Instagram, which made a huge difference when we were all locked down at home. Now, you might think it doesn't take a special mindset for a fitness company to offer fitness classes. Isn't that obvious? But here's the really special thing. What about the desk workers at the gym? Right, the gyms were closed, so what can the desk workers do to help out? Well, what it turned out is that many of these desk workers are actors as their main job. And if you're an actor, what is in your hand? You're really funny. Well, how does that help out? Well, what we had was schools were shut, so children were at home, and therefore what they offered was free Zoom storytelling sessions and online entertainment, which made a huge difference. It allowed them to take children off their working parents when they had an important business call. Now, that might only seem a small example, but I think what this highlights is that even a small company can think about, well, how can I create value for society by using what's in my hand? And if you use what's in your hand, then it actually doesn't cost you a huge amount of money. So when I take these two ideas, comparative advantage, if you are using your comparative advantage, you have a huge effect on society. And if you are affecting the material stakeholders, then benefiting material stakeholders ultimately then comes back and then benefits you in terms of profits. So applying these two principles to focus on what you should be looking at, those are things which allow purpose to be entirely consistent with long-term profits, which is the financial case that I referred to earlier. So let me dig down a little bit more into purpose, because this is about the practical implementation. So when I look at companies' purpose statements and I examine them and study them, I think the most useful statements are ones that are not obvious, where they rule out something else which could have been plausible. What do I mean by this? I'm saying a purpose is only meaningful if the opposite would also be reasonable. So to have a purpose statement like Costco's, our goal is to provide quality goods and services at the lowest possible price. We care about price even more than quality. That is meaningful, right? Because it would have been equally plausible for a company to have a purpose statement which says, we think quality is more important than price. Because it's quite reasonable for companies to say, we care about quality, not price. By Costco saying, we're actually doing the difference, we care about price even more. That tells you something. That tells you something that is not obvious. If instead you had a purpose statement like, our goal is to be the market leader, that tells you nothing, because no company's goal would be to be the number 20 in the market. Right, so a purpose is particularly useful, it provides particular direction if what it rules out is also something which could have been a plausible purpose. Like Rolls-Royce has the opposite purpose, which is to focus on quality. And so both purpose statements are useful, they tell you what they stand for. Also, I see with companies, they don't just have a broader purpose statement, but they also think about, well, how do we manage our company to achieve this? And I think the same principle applies. Something is only really meaningful if it's something which rules out things which would also have been reasonable. So there's some companies which think about their workers and they say, our goal is to provide rewarding work. That is completely meaningless, right? No company would say, our goal is not to provide rewarding work. So what is a good example? It's the following. So this is Netflix's statement on how they treat their employees. They say, we value integrity, excellence, respect, and so on. That doesn't mean anything. Every company cares about this. But here's what's interesting. What is special about Netflix is how much we encourage independent decision-making, share with each other openly, are extraordinarily candid, and only keep our highly effective people. And so why is that so meaningful? Because it rules out many other things. Like there's other companies who say, we want to provide job security and lifetime employment. Netflix says, no, we're just going to keep our highly effective people. Similarly, other companies might say we provide a lot of coaching and guidance. Here we say, no, we're encouraging independent decision-making. And this is also backed up by some research where the stronger and the clearer your purpose is in terms of focus, these companies are outperforming in the long term. So my final topic before I go to the Q&A is about the whole idea of reporting. So this is a big challenge that any CEO needs to face right now. People are saying, yes, you claim to be purposeful. Let's prove it. Let's show that you are actually walking the walk. Now, I fully agree with the importance of walking, not just talking, but I'm going to offer a little bit of a caution here about the increasing reliance on ESG metrics. Right, I'm sure you'll all know of the World Economic Forum framework and so many frameworks asking you to report measures of ESG. But when I look at those measures, they often are on the do no harm. Right, how much water do you use? How much carbon do you emit? And so on. Now, those are not unimportant, but are they really linked to the true purpose of a company? How would Vodafone launching M-Pesa? How would Mercedes offering, making ventilators? How would that show up in those metrics? They would not. So instead, when I think about reporting, I think about how do we think about actively doing good, actively creating value. And unlike these generic metrics, which are one size fits all, the relevant metrics for any purposeful company will be very specific and depend on your own purpose. So let me just give you a few examples. So one company is Olam. This is a Singaporean agri-business. And so what they say in their purpose is it's really important for us to prioritize our suppliers. We really need a sustainable supply chain. Right? That's in contrast to other companies for which maybe employees or customers might be more material. They say we really care about the suppliers. And so what we need to do is to ensure sustainable farming. But we recognize that many of our farmers are smallholder farmers. They don't have their techniques. So what we're going to do is launch our sustainability programs to encourage smallholder farmers to adopt this. And let's just track the number of these people who participate in our sustainability programs. That is a measure of actively doing good, not doing no harm. And it's something which is unique to what Olam's purpose is. The next one is Electronic Arts, the gaming company. So what they care about is diversity, as I'm sure you all do in your organizations. But when people think about diversity, it's normally workforce diversity. But Electronic Arts, because it's a gaming company, they realize diversity is a big challenge in terms of our customers, right? Our products are mainly bought by men. So if we are indeed truly committed to diversity, this is not just the box ticking diversity of workers that every company reports. Let's try to report diversity among our customer base. The final example is MyBank, which is China's first digital bank. Well, what do you think about the purpose of a bank? If a purpose provides financing that allows small businesses to start up and to set up companies that would not have been started without that financing. So what they measure is the number of small and micro enterprises that it receive its loans and who had never received a loan from any other bank before. Like many banks, they don't care about that. And even if they were to track this, they might look at it negatively. Like if you've never received a loan from any other bank before, then maybe you've got a problem with your credit. But if our goal as a bank to be purposeful is to provide loans to customers who might not have otherwise been able to start up their business, that is something that we would like to track. Okay, so let me just sum up before the Q&A. So what I've talked about here is the view of purpose as not just splitting the pie more fairly, but actively growing the pie. Right? Purpose is so powerful because it frees us from having to take every decision based on a financial calculation. Instead, can we motivate our decision by the desire to create value for society? And even if the motivation was to create value for society, nearly always things that do that ultimately then lead to profits. Now, absolutely, this should not be a free-for-all. Companies should not just think about creating value for society with no regard to profits, but how do we make sure that purpose is consistent with long-term returns? It's by applying the principles of materiality, focus on the stakeholder issues that are most important for your business model, and comparative advantage, ask yourself, what is in my hand? Thank you so much for the attention. Let me hand back to Zaris for the Q&A.
Thank you, Alex. It was a wonderful presentation. I don't think Zoom detracted actually from its quality. You came across very clearly, and we had the pleasure of listening to you. I want to highlight a few things. I must say, listening to you and making connections with Nikos's previous presentation, I had some flashes of insights, and I want to share with you some of your key points, which are also connected to the previous points. Now, one of the things that you talked about is its purpose is not just doing no harm. That's too minimal, you're telling us. Purpose is actively doing something good. So this is the axis of your presentation. This is your main thesis. And then you went on to tell us more how this can be put into action. Now, my first flash of insight came from the following. You say the beauty of purpose is that it frees executives from thinking about things in a purely financial way. I think this is powerful. I hope I'm not misinterpreting you. And I think this is connected to the previous point as well by Nikos. That is, purpose creates the intellectual space where we can think about things in a non-narrow way, non-financially narrow way. This is what makes Vodafone's mobile money scheme possible, because on strictly financial terms, it is not justifiable, but more broadly it is. And that adds value to society and ultimately adds value to the company itself. And you gave us also a very nice loop, shareholders, stakeholders, and they're connected by two arrows. So from shareholders, shareholders can contribute to stakeholders through comparative advantage. You gave the example of Mercedes. Fantastic in precision engineering, they can turn their skills into producing ventilators, therefore creating value for society at large and also expanding their own skills. And also, you gave us the materiality principle, stakeholders influencing shareholders. That is, you cannot satisfy everyone, so you've got to choose who are the most important stakeholders and think systematically about this. Now, I think this is a beautiful insight, and you gave us lots of evidence to support them. We know, those of us who deal with these things academically, we know there is evidence out there, and you presented a nice framework to think about this at the corporate level. Now, the question, I will open it to the floor for questions, but let me start the first one. So, what would be your advice to executives? Listening to you, assuming they have been convinced intellectually by you, what can they do differently on Monday morning to put the whole philosophy into action?
Thanks so much. This is a really important question. So I think the first one is to think clearly about the purpose of your business. So beyond just profit, why do you exist and who are you trying to serve? And importantly, when you try to answer that question, realize that purpose is as much about knowing what not to do as what to do, because you need to focus on a couple of areas. So just for me, when I think about my purpose as a finance professor, I define it as to use rigorous research to influence the practice of business. What I love doing is addressing practitioner audiences like this one, which is why it's such a privilege to be here today. But in order to do that, that does require me to cut back on other things. So I am admittedly not as involved, say, in the PhD program at London Business School. Why? The PhD students are really important, but I have lots of good colleagues and their responsibilities, their comparative advantages on that. Similarly, I am, as a company, your company is not the only company in the world. Yes, there are a lot of other challenges that the world faces, but there's hundreds of other companies, and maybe they are a better place to do that. So I think first will be to try to think about what is your purpose and define it very, very specifically. And then how will that then lead to you to doing things differently? So for me, it's really important in terms of allocating my time. So I will allocate less time, even if I was invited to give a great keynote speech at an academic conference or at a top university, I will turn that down in order to be able to do something like this. And then similarly for your companies, right, what's your most important resource? It might be financial resources, it might be headcount. So just like for a person, it might determine your time allocation. For a company, it decides your resource allocation. And to Nikos's point, which I really liked, about making sure you don't just talk purpose, but you do purpose. Where you allocate resources is really, really important for signalling, are you actually somebody who believes in your purpose?
Thank you, Alex. Now, knowing myself, I need to stop here. Otherwise, I will carry on asking questions and making comments, which is not my job, really. It is for you to ask any questions or make any comments. Any questions you may want to raise? I haven't seen anything through the system here, but feel free to take the... Yeah, Nikos. I was going to ask you at some stage, but carry on. No, carry on.
Hey, Alex, Nico.
We need, hang on a minute, we need the mic.
Alex, it's Nikos. Hi.
No, hang on. Does it work? Δεν δουλεύει νομίζω. Ναι, it's fine now.
Hello.
It's fine now. Yeah, carry
Alex.
on. Carry on.
Nikos, yes, hi.
How are you?
Good, thank you. Wish I could be there with you, but at least you've got some technology instead.
Well, I just want to make 2 or 3 comments. First of all, I'm glad to hear what I heard from you today. You have religion, which for a finance professor is a rarity. Also, you don't mind looking up words in the dictionary, so you're using them correctly, unlike a lot of your colleagues. I just want to, first of all, I want to say, Harry, I agree with all the high points you made. I think there's an absolute congruence between what Alex said and I said. Alex, remind me, what was the title of your first book?
Grow the Pie.
It's Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit. And what was great is that even though
is this your second book? Or your first book? Alex, your first book. What was the title of your first book?
Grow the Pie. So that's the only, it's not...
Okay, he made a lot of excellent points. You captured the most important ones. Let me, for the benefit of this audience, which I think is struggling with this issue daily, let me emphasize something second something he said, because I did not spend time on it. It has to do with a famous or infamous ECG. Okay? Alex is right that ECG is telling you a lot about not causing harm. The way I would put it is ECG is about compliance. That's why it is administered by accountants, okay? By no means it's about, small correction, Alex, competitive advantage, okay? Comparative is the old concept. So those 2 things are not the same, okay? And when they are presented as the same, they are part of the purpose washing. They are causing purpose a huge problem. Yeah. And every day on the Financial Times, on other newspapers, front page, there is a well-taken technical comment on ECG, which of course is missing the point, because whether it's a dog's breakfast conceptually or not, who cares? Basically, we're talking about 2 different animals. ECG is measuring compliance. Purpose is measuring, it has to do with competitive advantage.
I think it's an important point, Nikos, which Alex also mentioned. It is moving beyond the minimal, the ESG, and the compliance towards promoting a purpose actively. It's nice to emphasize. Any questions? Any comments? Let me see. I don't have any on here. Sorry, I beg your pardon. I'm blinded by the lights. Please carry on.
Is this on? Okay.
Yeah, carry on.
Alex, based on your experience, I can see from your bio that you're very involved with many companies and CEOs. Do you think that a company can stumble upon its purpose, or any purpose, by accident, by brainstorming, or by anything like that? Do you think that there has to be an inherent talent, an insightful leader, a God-sent hero for purpose to emerge in a company?
Thanks very much for that question. I think it's a great one. I think it's partly, it has to be deliberate, but partly it has to be emergent. So it does need to start from the top, because unless you have leaders who are committed to purpose, it's really difficult to embed purpose in an organisation, because you just don't have the tone from the top. But that being said, I think some mistakes that some organisations make is they think it's just the leaders who come up with a purpose. They decide the purpose and then they just tell everybody else to implement it. And that's also problematic because the employees don't feel involved in the purpose. And also, a nice purpose statement, let's say to build a digital society that enhances socio-economic progress, that is very difficult to relate to if you're not on the front line. If you're not customer facing, if you work in something like procurement or payroll or maybe internal accounting, it's hard to connect with a purpose. So I think the best companies that do that, they will try to have deliberate sessions where they will consult with their employees. So a number of companies that have brought me in to give workshops to the executive committee, but to give the same material to the employees so that they know that they're having the same conversations as senior management do. And there are some organisations which also will consult with their customers. So let me give an example. The National Health Service in the UK, their purpose is really important because it's part of the Constitution, it's part of something which is legally binding. And so when they came up with a purpose internally, they said that their purpose was to improve human health or something like that. Sounds obvious, right? A health service should help people recover. But only when they consulted with their patients did they realise the importance of a decent death, right? And for a service which was always focused on wellness, getting better, they might have ignored the fact that actually what is really important for many citizens is when you are in your final months or years and so on, to make sure that you're made comfortable. And so indeed, the purpose now of the NHS, which is part of the Constitution, says it is to make people better, but also to ensure a dignified death when the time comes for that, when there's actually only palliative care. And I think this is really important because without that external testing, they would not have recognised that importance of that other really key function.
Alex, can I take you up on this a little bit more? So, yes, the NHS, those of us who are familiar with the NHS, but in Greece as well, the national health system is extremely important. And the question is purpose defined once and for all, or does it shift in time?
I think it does need to shift, it does need to evolve. Just like a strategy will be evolving. Why? Because of purpose. It's about creating value for society. The societal issues, the world's biggest challenges, that will be changing over time. So there has to be some sort of happy medium, and that purpose can't just shift all the time, because then it's not something which really means anything. It's something which does take time to put into practice, but it does need to be flexible and to evolve with changes in time. So if indeed, let's say, changes in technology mean that we need to focus a bit more on, say, climate change adaptation rather than climate change mitigation, then some companies' purposes might change in that regard. Some of the powers or challenges faced with remote working, like that's something which is now something we didn't think about a couple of years ago, that might change some companies' purposes, particularly tech companies realising the power of what they might be able to do with remote working. So I do think it should be something which does adapt, but it shouldn't always be responsive. So I really like Nikos's point previously about ESG, because if it's compliance, if it's too responsive, then you just respond to whatever issue happens to be the order of the day. Right, so Mr. Floyd is killed, let's just donate millions to Black Lives Matter, when actually maybe the best thing to do is to think about diversity throughout the workforce, diversity in terms of your training, your recruitment, and so forth. And maybe the best thing for you to do is not to give money to charity, but if your purpose was to develop pharmaceutical products, just to keep investing in the pharmaceutical products and not just respond to the fact that there was this obviously big tragedy in Minnesota.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Now, I'm tempted, Alex. I want to ask you several things about this. Now, I want to take the pharmaceutical companies you mentioned. If you are the CEO of Pfizer today, and you are asked by third world countries to license off the vaccine, the COVID vaccine, and your purpose as a pharmaceutical company, obviously, it is to promote health for as many people as possible, then would you be tempted to say, or would you be pushed to say, yes, I'm willing to share my technology and my license with countries which cannot afford? Or would you rather privilege the shareholders' interest and say, hang on a minute, I'm not going to share with the rest of the world what has made me so successful in the last couple of years? How would you approach such a conflict here?
Yes. I think this is a really difficult decision. It's a great question to ask, because these trade-offs are when purpose really makes a big difference. And I would say certainly to consider the possibility of licensing it and giving it at cost or giving it for free. Why? Because that's something where it's based on your comparative advantage, which is making drugs which will save people's lives. And if it is to people who would not be able to afford it themselves, then I do think this is positive. Now, but in order to allow for that, you do need to be able to sell the drug at significantly above cost in developed countries. And so while there were other companies, I think AstraZeneca said we're always going to be offering at cost everywhere, that was great in terms of public relations, but I think it's not so realistic in that in order to be able to solve some of the challenges in developing countries, you do need to make profits from drugs. And there's a lot of drugs that just don't succeed. So Kenneth Frazier of Merck, he said, yeah, we do make profits from successful drugs because that allows us to develop all the drugs that don't succeed or all the drugs that we might have to give away for free. So why I'm using Merck as an example, because in 1987, they did something similar to what, Harry, you're asking about now. In 1987, they developed a drug called ivermectin, which cured river blindness. Now, it took them 6 years to develop that drug from clinical trials. It cost them a lot of money. And then this drug was solving a problem which was suffered by many countries in Africa. Now, first, what they tried to do is to try and get some foundations to fund it, like the equivalent of the Gates Foundation back then. They tried to get the US Department of International Development. And only as a last resort, they chose to give it away for free. And what was striking was that even 10 years after that decision, Roy Vagelos, the CEO, he said he never received any complaints from any shareholders about this. Right? Why? Because this was something which was good for wider society. It did substantially boost Merck's reputation. It led to lots of employees joining Merck, and they wrote to Vagelos saying, we are joining you because of this decision. We now see a purpose in this company. That's why we'd like to see our careers here. So I do think there's a possibility of doing that. I don't think it's a crazy to do. It may well be that you first want to run it past your anchor shareholders, because it is the shareholders who ultimately will be bearing the cost of that. But if you are doing this, you are pushing on an open door. So maybe 20 years ago, it might be harder because shareholders didn't care so much about this. But now, in many cases, it's shareholders asking companies to go faster on climate change, not slower, even though they know that that's going to cost them some money, because shareholders' goal might not just be financial, it might be partly social. So if you are to take that decision, while it might seem crazy to give something away at cost or below cost, it is something which is within the grain, and it is something which then can lead to many other benefits later in terms of reputation, in terms of employee retention, employee motivation.
Okay, thank you. Any last question, probably? Yes. Can we have the mic here, please? Here, sorry. Sorry, okay. Este κοντύτερα. Okay.
Is it better? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think. It's gone? Yeah, it's back. And the importance, thank you for the presentation around the importance of purpose, which is obviously also around holding us as leaders into account when we're making decisions. And I'm thinking of the three different stakeholders that you described: people, society, and probably customers, or big ideas around customer service. And I wanted to make the link also with the employees and the war for talent that we all experience at the moment. Have you done any piece of research that shows where the energy of the employees is around purposes, around big purposes, around personal development and growth, or a strong purpose around people, or a strong purpose around society, or a strong purpose around a big idea around customers? Where's the energy of employees or talent in these days? Or it's all?
Yeah, thank you. So this is something where I haven't done a formal scientific study, but it's something that's speaking to a lot of companies and actually speaking to my own students. I believe I've got quite a lot of sort of guidance and information about this. So 15 years ago, when I started out as a professor at Wharton, if I mentioned purpose to my MBA students, they would walk out of the room. They would not have cared. But nowadays, they think this is really important for determining what company they want to work for. I now teach this elective in a responsible business, and I ask the first question, I have a poll: how many of you want to go into CSR or ESG roles? Fewer than 10%. But they want to go into mainstream business, but they want the business that they work for to be a purposeful business. So out of the three things that you're saying, I think that the type of purpose that they really care about is just the impact of business on society, right? So customers, obviously really important, but in any business, customers are important. That's a way of generating revenue. Yes, employees, other employees are important. Yes, you do want good colleagues. You want to get a job which treats you well and so on. But like increasing now is the company that you're working for something that really inspires you? And I think it's particularly prevalent in a world of remote working. Right, so when I was at Morgan Stanley, you had so much motivation to work hard because you had the associates supervising you. There was a lot of direct supervision. Now that there's a lot of home working, effort is increasingly discretionary. And if it's something that you don't truly believe in, then it's something that you won't always be giving 100% in what you're doing. And this is something where just knowing all my students and speaking to them, and I'm still in touch with a lot of them after they graduate, there's a huge difference, I think, between them who are working for purposeful companies and how they'll talk about their jobs and what they're doing there and there to create value, and those who are not so aligned with the purpose. They see it as some nice lines on the CV and they see it as something as a stepping stone to something else.
Alex, can we say to this question at a more abstract level that ultimately it is what makes people proud of? Could it be that people identify with a company if they are proud about what they do in the company and what the company does for them as well as for society? And then the question is, what makes people proud of what they do? I'm reminded of Disney's problem a month ago. Do you remember when people wrote publicly, employees, against Disney because of the stand it took on LGBT rights in the States? Many employees thought that Disney was too compliant with the governor of Texas, or of Florida, who took a very strong stance against LGBTQ rights, whereas employees of the company wanted the company to be more assertive. So is it the case then that companies need to be doing things, obviously in response to their own employees, but also in response to wider societal concerns?
Yes, I think so, although I still would say it should be as linked as possible to comparative advantage and expertise. Because when you see these scandals, like it's really easy for a company to come out and say, I condemn George Floyd's murder, and yeah, that was absolutely something really bad. But I think it's even more important, as fully aligned with Nikos, is not just to talk about something, but to do stuff. So if it is as a result of this, I am going to be ensuring that we stamp out any discrimination within our hiring and our promotion. That really is more meaningful. Or maybe just don't say anything about it and say, actually, what we've always been doing is developing these great drugs. That is our purpose. That is our comparative advantage. Let's keep on doing something like this. And so the word pride was mentioned, and I think that's a great thing that you mentioned, Harry, because when I go back to what was in this survey, there were 5 dimensions: credibility, fairness, respect, camaraderie, and pride. And so what was captured by pride, well, some of the survey questions was, my work has special meaning, it is not just a job. So it's not necessarily my CEOs are saying things that are aligned with my values in the public sphere, but is it that your work has a special meaning, you see what you're actually doing, and even if you are not doing it yourself, are you proud of your company? So one bank that I work with, I know well, is NatWest in the UK. And one of the CEOs, the CEO of the markets division, told me a story where shortly after the pandemic, this group CEO took the management team out to a restaurant in Covent Garden. And then she had the restaurant owner speak, and she said, I came to this country 20 years ago. No bank believed in me. I had no history. NatWest, you believed in me. And as a result of this, I was able to start this restaurant and start many restaurants. I've employed all of these hundreds of people. And this CEO, the CEO of markets, the investment bank, right, known to be hard-headed finance people, this guy was just feeling really emotional. I feel so proud. I did not provide that loan. I'm in the investment banking part. I feel so proud about this, and then started telling this amongst the rest of the investment bank, and that's why I know about it, is the company that you're doing something that involves in something like this? Yesterday, I was giving a talk to HR directors about executive pay. I sat next to a guy at Vodafone. I said, oh, I use your example of M-Pays. He said, oh, you know this example? Yeah, that's why I chose to work for Vodafone. I used to be working at Deloitte as a compensation consultant, and when I wanted to move into a corporate, I chose to move to Vodafone because of what they've done to serve wider society. So I do think pride in what the organisation does, not just what it says, is a really important driver to attract talent.
Thanks, Alex. I was about to finish the session here because of time constraints, but I've seen a flurry of questions here, and I'm tempted to give ourselves 5 more minutes. So if you can bear with us for 5 more minutes, please. And I will ask you a couple of questions, if you can be as short as possible in your response. One is rediscovery of purpose. Companies may lose their purpose at some point in time. How can they rediscover purpose? How easy is it?
I think it is not too hard to, because any company, whenever you were started, you were presumably started with a purpose. So when I think about people starting businesses, entrepreneurs, why do you start a business when it's so risky? You could have taken a job as a management consultant or something. When I think about my MBA students, why do they start their own businesses? That is because of purpose. And over time, you might lose sight of that because of the daily challenges. But I would say, let's think about going back to the beginning. What was the purpose that caused me? Or maybe it wasn't me, maybe it was some other founder, but what was the company established with to begin with? Is that purpose still valid now? Maybe the times have changed, but if the times have changed, well, how does that purpose evolve? But at least you have a starting point. So even if there's no clear purpose now, you did have a starting point at some point.
And another question is the purpose really unique for each company? At some level of abstraction, it seems to me that all telecommunication companies, for example, may have the same purpose, connecting people. But surely this is too generic, too undifferentiated. How can we have uniqueness in corporate purpose?
Yeah, so actually you might not be able to have uniqueness. So what I was highlighting was the importance of focus. But focus might not be unique, because within the same industry, you might have companies with pretty similar purposes. So I think the uniqueness is actually in the execution, not just the statement. So I think lots of companies put a lot of effort into the statement. I think the statement is important, but what is, I think, really unique is, are you actually delivering on it? Are you actually walking, not just talking, as Nikos was saying earlier? Are you in difficult situations where you're faced with the pharmaceutical decision of Pfizer that you mentioned, Harry? Are you taking a decision that you might not have taken otherwise if you didn't have a purpose? So the true test of, is your purpose being put into practice, is it has to lead you to taking some decisions that you would have not taken otherwise.
So uniqueness to some extent comes from what Nikos was saying earlier, walking the walk. And uniqueness comes from the extent to which you really mean what you say and you align the organization because of the purpose. So that might be the element of uniqueness as well.
Yeah, and it's just the excellence that I highlighted,
the excellent,
which often people forget about. So let's say any professor aims to be a good teacher or a good researcher. Well, that's not novel. But if my job is to make sure that I am excellent in providing a dynamic talk with evidence plus practical examples, that delivery, I think, was generally more unique than just my broader purpose of just giving talks.
Final question, truly final. What about government or semi-government organizations? How easy is it for them to develop purpose?
Well, I think it should be easy. Why? Because I think you have powerful tools as a government, which companies don't. So I've talked about the idea of growing the pie, and the whole idea of growing the pie is premised in the fact that what you do to create value for society ultimately affects the company's profits, at least in the long term. But that will not be the case if you have externalities, and those are things where you can impact society but you don't feel the consequences. So if there are things such as taxes on carbon emissions or sugar or plastic bags in the UK, those are things that cause you to internalise externalities. And also on the positive side, like, can we provide subsidies or can we partner with companies? So the one part of Vodafone and M-Pesa that I didn't have time to mention was not just Vodafone alone, it was Vodafone in partnership with the Department for International Development, and that it was the latter which actually noticed the use of mobile phones to transfer mobile minutes to each other. So I think the government, through both their policy, but also through their actual activities, because you do have departments such as the Department for International Development or International Aid, you not facing, I think, the short-term need to deliver profits that some companies have, that might also be able to help you explore some of the unexplored parts of purpose.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for a wonderful presentation and your insights. You gave us lots of things to think about. And pity you were not able to be here with us, but we benefited a lot from your virtual presence. Thank you so much. I want to make a... Just I want to conclude with 2 points. Το ένα είναι αυτό που είπε ο Άλεξ, ότι purpose is only meaningful if the opposite is true. Πάρα πολύ ενδιαφέρον. Διότι αυτό που συνήθως ο σκοπός είναι μια νεφελώδης κατάσταση, πολλές φορές λέμε, που προσπαθούμε να είμαστε καλοί με όλους και να τα έχουμε καλά με όλους. Αυτό που μας είπε ότι όταν είσαι purposeful, είσαι σαφής στο τι θέλεις και τι δεν θέλεις. Αυτό το θεωρώ ιδιαίτερα σημαντικό. Και το δεύτερο σημείο είναι αυτό που είχε πει ο Νίκος ο Μουρκογιάννης στην αρχή. Η καλύτερη δήλωση ever όλων των εποχών για το τι συνιστά σκοπό είναι η επιτάφιος ομιλία του Περικλέους. Σε λιγότερο από 1000 λέξεις ο Περικλής αρθρώνει τι είναι η Αθήνα. Δεν υπάρχει καλύτερο κείμενο που να έχει γραφεί ποτέ για το τι συνιστά σκοπό. Εγώ όταν θέλω λίγο να αποσαφηνίσω μέσα μου τι είναι το πανεπιστήμιο, γιατί υπάρχει, πώς πρέπει να λειτουργούμε, διαβάζω ξανά και προσπαθώ να το βάλω στα δικά μου συμφραζόμενα. Είναι ένα κείμενο το οποίο εμπνέει όχι μόνο τους πολιτικούς, εμπνέει οποιονδήποτε διοικεί οργανισμούς και προβληματίζεται ακριβώς για υπαρξιακής φύσεως ερωτήματα όπως γιατί υπάρχουμε και πώς υπάρχουμε. Ευχαριστώ.